Hello, and welcome to the Brief Podcast, where we try to bring you context, analysis, and perspectives on current events and international affairs. I'm your host, Jim Clancy. Be sure to follow us if you like what you find here on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. On this edition, a reality check. After more than 9 months of conflict in Gaza, do Israelis support further bloodshed to eliminate Hamas? What is the mood on the ground among Israelis as negotiations are stalled to release a dwindling number of hostages held in Gaza all this time? Has the declaration of arrest warrants for Prime Minister Netanyahu and others for war crimes, for a policy of starvation against all Palestinians in Gaza, changed how Israelis really see themselves? Well, joining us to share his views and perspectives, well-known and respected political commentator and columnist Chemi Shalev. For many years, he wrote on the pages of Haaretz, and he appeared on CNN as well as other news channels to share his views. Chemi Shalev, hello, and welcome to The Brief.
Thank you for having me.
You know, this war now going on for more than 9 months. We've got, almost 38,000 Palestinians killed, another 90,000 wounded. We've still got 100 Israelis, at least, being held captive in Gaza. Did anyone think it was going to go on this long?
I don't think anyone thought it could go on this long. First of all, because Israel has never been involved in a war that is in any way comparable in terms of length. Not a full-scale war, which is supposedly this is, but it really isn't, because the whole army is not engaged in this. And so I think people thought at the beginning that it would take a month or two, even though the leaders were warning. By the leaders, I mean Netanyahu and the defense minister were saying this could be a long campaign. But even when they said it could be a long campaign for Israelis, when you look at previous campaigns in Gaza, is, 2 weeks is long. 1 month is long. I don't think people realized that it would go on for so long. And of course, they didn't realize that while this was going on, there would be another sort of self-contained war going on in the north, which could erupt at any minute. I don't think anybody imagined any of this on October 7th. But I have to tell you that on October 7th, probably a day that Israel was crazy or went crazy. And so I don't think people devoted a lot of thought. They just, the sentiment was we have to go in and take care of this problem.
Well, it came as a shock.
I'll remind you that when President Biden came here in the midst of the war and insisted and told Bibi, you have to think about the day after. And Bibi refused, but I have to tell you that even Israelis thought it was very strange. Why is he talking about the day after? First of all, we have to, destroy Hamas. That was the sentiment. And so people didn't think. I think people never gave a thought, and now it's been about 7-8 months more than they ever imagined it would go on.
I think it's been a very different scene between Israel, the citizens of Israel, and people in the outside world, because already, I sense that the Western media is moving on towards politics and other things that, that sense of October 7th trauma quickly faded in the West and concentrated instead on the plight of the Palestinians in Gaza. But it's been a different experience inside Israel, hasn't it?
Yes. It took a long time for Israelis to wake up to the fact that the world is seeing on its television screens scenes from Gaza that Israelis had not seen until that point. And the reason was that for the first few months after October 7th, but even until today, the Israeli media gave saturation coverage to the events of October 7th, to the minute events, as far as it could, to each and every victim, and there were 1,200 victims, and gave very little attention to other issues, including the fact that Israel was destroying, say, whole neighborhoods in Gaza. But most importantly, the issue of the hostages has kept October 7th alive. In many ways, it is October 7th today, because the hostages are not back, and this has become a national trauma, a mini trauma inside a bigger trauma. And as long as the hostages are not returned from the media's point of view and from Israel's point and from the public opinion's point of view, October 7th is still alive, is still traumatizing a lot of Israelis. And it has, as you said, it has created a big gap in the perception of itself and of the world between Israel and the rest of the world. And Israel does not understand why Israelis do not understand why the world is reacting the way it is reacting.
Now, I want to quote one of your former colleagues, Ashel Pfeiffer, who wrote in the pages of Haaretz, Israel is fighting two wars, the official one in Gaza and a fundamentalist messianic one. Both wars are ostensibly against the same enemy, but they are also a war between two Israels. Just as settlers proved in the past, they don't need to have the support of a majority of Israelis or even the government, just so long as most Israelis and the government don't stop them from building their own reality.
First of all, I agree. Second of all, I have to point out this has been the reality more or less for the past 50 years or 60 years. You know it as well as I do. There may have been even leftist governments that opposed settlements, in practice allowed the settlements to continue. Now we have two new factors. One, we have the most right-wing government in the history of Israel. Two, it's the first government in which there is a clear majority, one, against a Palestinian state, and two, for building up the West Bank as much as possible. And three, we have and I'll add a fourth, but three, we have the war. And under the guise of war, they can funnel funds and get projects moving without anybody paying attention, because people are paying attention to the war. But perhaps the most important factor is the fact that we have a prime minister who constituted this coalition only because it was the only coalition that might have freed him from his criminal proceedings. And this may start to sound familiar to Americans. And that's the only reason this government has been, and it's the only reason why he won't give up this government under any circumstance. And so repeatedly, their demands are met. There are crises along the way. Their demands are met. He does not interfere in whatever they're doing in their very powerful ministries to build up settlements in the West Bank. So the answer, I don't know if I would call it a war. That's perhaps the only thing, it's not comparable. It's not two wars, in my opinion. It's two crises, say, two existential crises. But yes, that's an issue as well.
The IDF is preparing to release at least a preliminary report on one area of October 7th. Is that going to renew the trauma all over again?
Yes. There's no reason to renew. It's ongoing. It will inject new adrenaline into the trauma, if you can say that. We're talking here about a kibbutz that suffered serious losses, but there's a famous incident there in which there was it's called an Israeli commander ordered a tank to fire at a building in which there were hostages, and apparently he knew there were hostages inside as well as terrorists. And so this has been, and this story has been circulating since October 7th, and now we'll get the definitive report. There are going to be two opposite reactions. This is going to be apparently a very damning report about how the IDF was prepared, and people who are criticizing the IDF will have new ammunition.
Well, this is a so-called Hannibal directive?
Yes. I don't know whether it was used there. I mean, Hannibal directive is a whole procedure. As far as I know, there were, I don't know whether it was named as such, and we'll find out in the report. It may have been named as such, in which case there will be an even greater outcry, because Israelis do not expect this procedure, which means to be used to have been used under these circumstances. It wasn't meant for these circumstances. It was meant for when there's the terrorist squad kidnapping people to the other side. But there is a stark contrast, Jim, and this is perhaps this will also have a great influence. A stark contrast between the fact that the IDF will be publishing a very self-condemning investigation, which will lay bare the truth, and will find whoever is responsible. There will be criticism of the IDF. There will be criticism of, we know from leaks, of the ill-preparedness of the IDF on that day. But one has to say there will also be a stark contrast between the fact that the IDF conducted this investigation, reached very painful findings, and I assume personal recommendations about commanders that may have to be removed. And this stands in stark contrast to the fact that the government, and especially the prime minister, have been refusing to appoint a judicial commission of inquiry, which is always what happens when there is an event or a catastrophe of this magnitude, and it's not happened yet. And there's a very simple reason he doesn't want to appoint a judicial commission of inquiry, because it will most likely objectively find him responsible and depose him or recommend that he be deposed. And from his point of view, it will necessarily be biased against him and will therefore remove him from office. And so he's not appointing it. And the IDF report will highlight that.
Is that action by Netanyahu? It's really, you don't see a groundswell of people coming out specifically to say, get rid of Netanyahu. We see tens upon tens of thousands of people coming out on behalf of the hostages against changes in the Supreme Court's ability to decide the rule of law inside Israel. But we don't see that many. And sometimes I wonder, among all those people that are out on the streets, how many times did they cast votes for Bibi Netanyahu?
Not many, not a lot. The people who go out to demonstrate are not people who voted for Netanyahu, but they are. The demonstrations do underrepresent the sentiments of the public as they are reflected in the polls. There are two reasons for that. I think, first of all, these demonstrations happen every week. It's not simple to go out every week, and they need a trigger. For example, when the prime minister fired the defense minister, and 5 or 6 times more people came out. But more importantly, there has been a mix between demonstrations to free the hostages and demonstrations that called for Netanyahu to be removed. And there are many people, I know them, I speak to them, who feel uncomfortable going to demonstrate against the prime minister or calling for his removal at a time of war. Because in a sense, they feel they're demonstrating against the government, against the IDF, and you do not do that in a time of war. That's something which did not exist before October 7th. And I think that once, and if there is a ceasefire, you'll see that the protest movement, that's its moment of test. That's when we'll see whether there is enough anger to get hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, which is what is needed to move the system.
We had a discussion earlier before this podcast, and in it you mentioned the word disintegration, some kind of a sense by the left, by the right. People inside Israel are experiencing a sense of disintegration. What did you mean?
Well, I mean that, first of all, I can only talk about myself, my relatives, my friends, and the people that, my contacts that I still talk to. And there is a sense of doom and gloom, and I'm not saying that as some cliche. Doom and gloom are the words. And the reason for the doom, first of all, is still the trauma of October 7th, because Israelis realize that they are much more vulnerable than they had thought. But it's more importantly, it's the fact that we're 9 months later, Netanyahu is still in power. Everything is going down. Israel's, not only is the war not going anywhere that people can perceive, but if you look back at October 6th and you compare, there's no comparison. The economy is going down. The nation thought that after October 7th it would be united. It's just as divided as it was before. I think one of the signs of this discontent, or maybe its symptoms, is the fact that at least among people, of those who go to demonstrate, and in Tel Aviv, there's talk about some sort of movement. I don't want to say mass movement, but a significant movement of people who are either seeking to move abroad, young people, doctors, high-tech people seeking to move abroad, or have already moved abroad. Because it's very easy for certain sectors of Israelis to relocate, because they have required skills. And so there is a sense that we're not, and also people don't see why and how the political situation will change after October 7th, because the polls, even though they indicate that if Netanyahu will go down, they don't indicate that there is any clear-cut government that will emerge that will be, any more stable. And so there's a sense of angst. There's an angst that the country has gone off the rails, and there is no one in sight no leader in sight who seems capable of putting it back. There's no ray of light. There's no light at the end of the tunnel right now. And so, yes, there is a sense that I think people look, Israel, I don't want to get into the whole history of Zionism, but it's a special enterprise, and people are questioning whether the country, I'm not sure this is true of other places, but whether the country can survive this ordeal. And one also has to add into that factor, for many people, the October 7th was proof that there will never be peace with the Arabs, and that we will live in our swords for the rest of our days, and that that's our fate. And this is something which also does not contribute to, and now thinking about it, also, that this issue came up of the ultra-Orthodox going to the army. And this has become a major emotional issue, I think, for a lot of secular Israelis. And the fact that it seems that nothing is going to change is very disappointing, and adds on to the sense that things are not moving in any constructive direction.
Do Israelis understand, like you said, they've been steeped in what happened on October the 7th. They've been steeped in the stories of individuals, 1,200 of them, and their stories, what they have to recount, what they deliver, that trauma over and over again. Do they see what it means for a state to be accused of war crimes, a war crime of starving the people, the children, the infants, the women, people who were non-combatants, starving them to death?
It's a very it's a complex response. First of all, I think there is the gut reaction, the initial reaction, and probably still the majority opinion is that this is all an anti-Israeli, not to say it's all a result of anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli feelings. And in similar cases in other countries, such measures weren't employed. I also have to tell you, and I consider myself to be a left-wing or a moderate Israeli, I do not believe most of these, not most, but a significant part of these accusations, especially when it comes to intention. When you listen to the deliberations at Hague, there was this issue of genocide implies intention, and I don't, intention to kill civilians. I do not believe that. I do not think that the IDF intentionally killed civilians, but I'm sure that one will find if there ever is an Israeli Commission of Inquiry, that in the months or in the weeks after October 7th, when there was this massive aerial bombing there was far less concern for civilian casualties than there would have been under other circumstances. And yes, there were issues with the aid coming through or not coming through. Look, it's very complex. First of all, Israelis don't really know that there is an occupation. They don't live with the occupation. And when you don't know that before October 7th, there were 50, 60 years of occupation, which the world objected to in the first place, then you're taken aback by the fact that they are reacting so vigorously to what happened the months, starting from a month after October 7th. And second of all, I think that there's been an issue of overkill because of what I said, because some of the accusations are, no Israeli can accept them. This has undermined the credibility of the accusations. So I would say Israelis are aware of their deteriorating international situation, and it's not a deterioration, it's a free fall if you compare it to October 6th. This is one of the issues on which they'll blame, the foreign ministry doesn't have, what usually happens is that we get into an argument about, does the foreign ministry have a good enough propaganda or hasbara arm, and why is no one in charge and things like that. I don't think Israelis have internalized the fact that the occupation in and of itself it's an albatross around Israel's neck from the point of view of the international community. And of course, without the occupation, we would not have had this fierce reaction to Gaza. I mean, if there had not been this situation in the first place. And I think more disconcerting and also feeding into the Israeli reaction is the fact that in many cases, especially in the demonstrations, Hamas is somehow described as, there's Israel on one hand and there's Hamas on the other hand, and Israelis can't accept that. So, all in all, the deterioration in the international position of Israel has not harmed the government as much as you might expect under other circumstances, because Israelis do not blame them for that. They blame them for most other things, but not for that. They blame an international climate of being against Israel and so on. I don't want to make a comparison on the substance, but in South Africa, when they were already under significant sanctions, it took a while. First of all, until the sanctions bit, and until they realized that they were facing a brick wall. I don't think Israelis feel they're facing a brick wall. They feel that this is a bad spot. That if other things get better, this will also get better.
Well, since its inception, Israel has been criticized, and many Israelis would say they faced outsized criticism for their size, as they, have experienced history through the years. This is no different. But do they really expect the rest of the world to accept that in order for us to have a Jewish state, we're going to have apartheid, or some form of it, that's just a word, we're going to have an endless occupation of the Palestinian people?
First of all, I don't see any reason why the Israelis should not expect that, because that has been the situation from day one of the occupation. The world has opposed the occupation and has done nothing or almost nothing to reverse it or to end it. And so I think, as I said before, I think Israelis are alarmed by the international community's reaction, and I think they are praying for it to be over. And I think they believe that once the Gaza operation is over and there's no more hostilities, and say there is some status quo there, then this whole thing will subside. And by the way, I think they're right. I don't think you think that if Gaza, say there's no battles anymore, and the world will go on to its next crisis. It won't. I'm not sure that we've reached a point of no return. You may think otherwise. A point of no return regarding the international community's attitude to the Israeli-Palestinian question. I'm not sure we've reached a point of no return, because people adapt very quickly.
Chemi, a lot of what you talk about, I mean, the occupation going on for so long, it's been enabled by the United States. The war in Gaza has certainly been enabled by U.S. arms. I can't point to the IDF for intentionally bombing civilians, but I know what the power of one of those 2,000-pound bombs that was dropped in neighborhoods in Gaza was going to do. And it's not a precision weapon. It is a weapon that annihilates everything in its path. But it's produced a change in young people in the United States. We've seen it on the campuses, but beyond that, and not only the United States, is there a realization that people are not seeing Israel as the Jewish state as much as a white supremacist state?
It's very difficult for me to argue with a term such as white supremacist state, which, in my opinion, I realize that you're right in describing this. But it is so far removed from what I consider to be historical reality that it's very hard for me to contend with it. I think that Israelis have not adapted to the fact that they are considered the bad guys, that they are the occupiers, that they are the colonialists. That's not the terms and the worldview that Israelis think in. I don't think Israelis want to settle the West Bank as the right wing does. I don't think they want the occupation to go on forever. But they have no other solution. that they can point to when they say, okay, no occupation, but this is what we're going to do. No other solution. There may be objectively a solution. There's no other solution that an Israeli politician can stand up and say, this is the solution. And even the left, the Israeli Zionist left, since October 7th, has been speaking very little about how we're going to solve this problem. And not only that, when you think about the fact that Netanyahu refused to contemplate the day after, and to this very moment, we have no idea what's going to be the situation. I think that we could be entering some sort of, say there is some arrangement, but it will be a low intensity confrontation in Gaza, which will prevent Israelis from confronting the reality of the occupation. So now I'm asking you whether if the international community persists with magnifying and putting its focus on this issue, then we're talking about a different situation than existed before, and we'll have to see. I'm telling you that the initial reaction of Israelis will be outrage and a sort of negative reaction, which is I think this is a time. Israelis have not moved left because of this; they've moved to the right, but because they also, even people on the right, but understand that Netanyahu has to go, there's a misperception, as if the public opinion has swung away from Netanyahu. It has, but only in the sense of his personality, not in the sense of the policies that he represents. And so that points to the fact that no, Israelis have not even despite all that's happened, Israelis have not confronted their new international situation. And I don't think it factors into their decision-making at this point.
Well, the Israeli-Gaza Palestinian issue is now a domestic political issue in the United States. President Biden has reached out. He's got, of course, his ceasefire plan that's out there. But people go back to the bear hug that he gave to his friend, Bibi Netanyahu, his unlimited support, almost unlimited support that he has given the Israeli military. And it looks like it could cost him the election. If his health doesn't, it looks like... there are other factors there as well. But, I mean, Israelis have to know the importance of this friend. Maybe they count that President Trump will come along, but there's no telling really what he'll do.
It's one of I'm not going to answer your question. What I will say is that it's one of the saddest facts for me of Israel that in public opinion polls since 2016, and certainly in 2020 when Trump and Biden, and still today, which I found to be incredible, the overwhelming majority of Israelis would prefer to have President Trump in the White House rather than President Biden. And in my opinion, just the results of this are a reflection of all sorts of unhealthy trends in Israeli society and Israeli public opinion. So Israelis appreciated President Biden's initial support, but very quickly, when he made his first criticism, that was used by the right wing to undermine support for him. And it's very interesting that in America he's being perceived as, he may be hurt by the fact that he lent so much support to Israel, while in Israel, the attitude is a bit more lukewarm, and they still prefer Donald Trump. And I think this shows that there's been some basic corruption of values in Israeli society, which reflects on everything else that we've been talking about.
It does reflect on everything. And as we move forward, looking at the situation, it has a lot to do with how it's going to be resolved, whether it's going to be just left alone to fester or whether somebody's actually going to put some of that diplomatic will into it. Not an easy thing to do by any stretch of the imagination. And we just wonder what's left to be done. I mean, there's been so much that the U.S. has meant to Israel. And when the Prime Minister comes to speak before Congress, I can say this without any risk of being wrong or, politically incorrect. Bibi Netanyahu is going to get standing ovation after standing ovation. Everybody's going to stand up and sing his praises. He's going to get standing ovations that President Biden could never even dream about.
It's very embarrassing. What do you want me to say?
I guess it's embarrassing for all of us.
No, I'll tell you the one thing, and it has to do with it. There are two paths that Israel could take, even though it hasn't been like that. One is that Bibi Netanyahu will continue to be prime minister. And if he continues to be prime minister, we will have the same trends that we've had and an acceleration, no matter what the international situation is. But it is critical. It is a critical question. And in my opinion, the elections in the U.S. in November are more critical for Israel's future than anything else, at least in the because what Netanyahu is waiting. Why does Netanyahu support Donald Trump? Netanyahu. I don't think he supports him because he thinks that Trump is a better friend of Israel. Netanyahu realizes who he's dealing with, that somebody that looks out mainly for himself. What Netanyahu wants is the chaos, both internationally and domestically, that the election of Trump will create, and the fact that there will no longer be an American administration that will issue a White House statement when he oversteps, say, like he did in the judicial reform. I'm not talking about the Palestinians. And under that guise, Israeli democracy can be undermined. Israeli democracy, in my view, can be undermined. And I don't know, he can stay prime minister for life. Maybe, I'm not putting that beyond him. If Netanyahu is removed or resigns or whatever, on that day, Israel's situation will change dramatically. It's very hard to predict what will happen. I mean, say tomorrow Netanyahu isn't here, and his replacement, say, is a right-wing, a right-wing prime minister, but a sane man, a man who doesn't have other agendas. Israel's situation will improve dramatically. If suddenly we have a prime minister who includes the opposition, doesn't try to portray it as traitors. If we have a prime minister who wants to work with the U.S. administration because that's the strategic thing to do, not because it's convenient. Anyway, the international situation, Israel will get a ton of goodwill from the international community. Correct me if you think otherwise. If it removes Netanyahu from power. And it's astonishing to me that Israelis may not realize it, are willing to pay such a steep price just to keep him there. Because it's obvious to everyone that he is the red flag for a lot of the animosity towards Israel. And if there was a different government without Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and all these people, all these right-wing lunatics, or lunatics may be the wrong word because I may be sued, all these right-wing nuts, the situation will change. The situation will change. And it's hard to predict. I'm not talking even about a left-wing prime minister. I'm just talking about any other person other than Netanyahu.
But I don't
think... If we stick with Netanyahu, I'll just finish. If I think, my personal opinion is that if Netanyahu remains in power, Israel will reach the existential crisis that people are afraid of. And its very existence will be in question.
I think, as I look at it, the outside world is not basing it all on the prime minister. I think Israelis feel that very much, and I think it's based on the policy. There's a lot about the policy. There's a lot about continuing. People are already talking about, we'll go and resettle Gaza. We're going to build settlements next in Gaza. All of these things are floated out there, and the West Bank is aflame, and there's a risk of war on the northern border.
I agree. I'm just saying that he is a red flag. Nothing will change. Nothing will change for the better. If it will change, it will only be for the worse, as long as he's in power. And there is the only chance for a change, which is what we were talking about, is if he's removed from power. It's very simple. It's quite a simple equation. Once there is a different prime minister, yes, he will face a more dangerous or more difficult international situation than he would have faced on October 6th. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But it will be a prime minister, I assume, who will engage with the world, at least to diffuse the crisis. This is not something that Netanyahu wants to do. For Netanyahu, crisis is not necessarily bad news, because the only thing that interests him are what his base is interested in. And his base, as you know from the U.S., believes in anything. So Israel is in a very difficult situation because of the occupation. The only hope of resolving this issue, even on a temporary basis, is if Netanyahu is not in power. And there's no point in discussing it generally, even though I agree with you that it's the policies that are the issue. But still, we're in a special situation, as the U.S. will be, and as the U.S. was when it had a president who was not working according to the accepted rules.
Final question. I'm asking you because you're the realist, and I know I'll get an honest answer from you, but I'm warning you, it's not a difficult one. In the wake of October 7th, do the Israelis largely feel any sympathy for what's happening to the Palestinians in Gaza, what's happening to them on the West Bank? There's no, I don't see any real reaching out between the Great Divide.
I'm sorry to say that the answer is that they probably feel less empathy with the Palestinians today than they did before October 7th.
Despite all the casualties. I mean,
they were not that empathetic before October 7th. So let's look, it's what we spoke about. October 7th is not over from the Israeli point of view. The rage that October 7th created has not subsided. The sense that we're dealing with, quote, savages that there's no point in talking to is still as strong as it was. And yes, I think there is a slowly creeping, but when I say slowly creeping, I mean really slowly creeping sense that, first of all, we may have exaggerated in Gaza, and two, there is an issue there that needs to be solved. But if you're asking me whether Israelis have more empathy today with the Palestinians than they did before October 7th, the answer is no. It's a flat-out no.
Chemi Shalev, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to join us on The Brief. It's not been real encouraging, Chemi, but at the same time, it has been very real.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this discussion with Chemi Shalev, and we invite you to sample our other editions that are available on YouTube, on Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. Give us a like, a follow, or why don't you subscribe? Again, thanks. I'm Jim Clancy, and you've been briefed.